Hello and welcome to Doing Just DVD. This week, let's talk about the Tremors franchise, because I recently upgraded my old bare bones DVD version of the film to the fancy new Arrow Blu-ray Special Edition. Weird low-budget monster films have always been a particular favourite of mine, and you know, every now and then the stars will align, lightning in a bottle kind of situation, and one will sort of be elevated above all the others and be particularly, better than it kind of even deserves to be. And Tremors is one of those films. At least that is, in my opinion. The year was 1990. Screenwriters Brent Maddock and S.S. Wilson were hot properties in Hollywood at the moment. They've just had hits with Short Circuit and Batteries Not Included. So, they were getting asked questions like, what old scripts have you got lying around? Is there anything else we can make for you? And they had one which was originally titled Land Sharks. And so along with fresh director Ron Underwood on his very first full-length feature, they would go on to make what became the film Tremors. It's a bit of an odd film to classify. It kind of gets billed as a horror comedy, but I also kind of find it fairly light on the horror side. I feel it's a bit more of a comedy action, but regardless, what it is loads of fun. And sometimes that's the most important thing. The cast and crew seemingly had a very fun time making it, and that comes through in the resulting picture. Starring Kevin Bacon, who is probably the most famous of the people in this franchise. I found it refreshing to hear him in an interview say he basically only took this role because he needed the money. I appreciate an actor who's in it for the craft and the method, but I also just as much appreciate those who are just here because it's a job. Like the famous story from Michael Caine, who says he's never seen Jaws 4, but he's definitely seen the house it built. And so, having a fairly famous name helps, elevate it above that B level. Not that any of the other actors are terrible, but the Tremors franchise is the only reason I've heard of anyone else in this film. But the thing is, unfortunately, despite all of that, it didn't actually perform very well at the box office. It didn't make a loss, but it was apparently way under what they expected and was a bit of a disappointment. However, thankfully, this is 1990 and there is one big newish booming market at this point, and that is home video. Somehow it managed to find its audience after the fact and apparently became the most rented video of 1990. And so Tremors goes on to become a bit of a cult classic, and as far as I'm aware, it's fairly well known, but as a big fan myself, I may have a bit of bias there. But either way, what I expect is more of a surprise to some people is that at this point, there are now 7 Tremors films. 6 years later, as mentioned, the original has become a bit of a cult classic, and so Universal obviously start thinking, this has sequel/franchise potential, and anything that'll make some more money for these guys. And so, in 1996, we get Tremors Ii Aftershocks. The Graboids are back, but this time it's in Mexico rather than Nevada. They don't manage to tempt Kevin Bacon back, but they do manage to get his co-star Fred Ward. And of course Michael Gross as Bert Gummer, who was more of a side character in the original film, but becomes more important as the franchise goes on. Still, it basically follows almost the exact same formula as the original, with the exception of the location. Kevin Bacon's character being missing, he is simply replaced by some other young Kevin Bacon-esque guy. There's even a few sort of meta-in jokes in the script, sort of constantly referring to him as the new guy. They add some interesting new lore to the whole Graboid life cycle, but in general, most of the story beats basically match the original. And while the creatures in the original film were all entirely done as practical models and puppets and things, it being 1996 at this point, there are some attempts here to use CG. And unfortunately, it being the early days of such things, they kind of stand out at this point, usually due to the low quality lighting. But thankfully it's used fairly minimally. They're obviously kind of experimenting with, can we do this yet? And it allows them to try some things that they've never been able to do practically. It just, takes you out of it a bit when you see these are obviously sort of pasted on top. The director of the original has moved on at this point, and while he doesn't seem to have made a huge amount of films over his career, he does appear to have become a very prolific TV director. There are many episodes of all sorts of series that have him credited. So at this point the franchise basically becomes handled entirely by the creators Maddock and Wilson, writing and directing films 2, 3 and 4. So speaking of which, another 5 years later, it's now 2001 and we have Tremors 3 Back to Perfection. This one brings the story back to the original location of the first film and also brings back a couple of the more minor characters from that film because, you know, they're still living in the same place. But as you can see from the cover at this point, Michael Gross as Burt Gummer has kind of become the central figure of this franchise. But of course there does also still need to be a sort of Kevin Bacon-esque replacement guy in a cowboy hat to go along with him as a sidekick. Neither the second one or the third one reach the levels of the original film, but the location of number 3 really helps elevate it a little bit. Along with the more returning characters, it sort of has more of that feel of the original because it's the same location and the same people, but having a slightly different twist on the events that are happening. Now, 2 years after that one, 2003 at this point, they actually then went on to make a TV series for the Sci-Fi Channel. It got cancelled after only half a season, so there's only 13 episodes of it, and there's no actual official way for me to own it in this country. Not on a physical Region 2 disc anyway. I believe it might be available digitally on iTunes, but that's not a service I use, so I haven't actually checked if that's anywhere near up-to-date information. I have of course got a copy and watched it, but I won't be talking about where I got that from. It's also been a long time since I actually watched it, and I don't remember a lot about it, but I remember enjoying it at the time, knowing full well that having a graboid attack every week on a TV series wouldn't be sustainable. They added a bunch of weird government conspiracies and crazy science stuff so they could, you know, have additional story options. Even had Christopher Lloyd as a mad scientist living in the desert doing experiments and things. I should probably give that series another watch at some point. It's only 13 episodes after all, but let's be honest, it's not that high up my priority list at the moment. But still, despite the failed TV series, 1 year later in 2004, the film franchise still continues, and we get Tremors 4, The Legend Begins. Now this one is interesting because, as the title implies, is more of a prequel. It's set in a completely different time frame, and so we get to see the little town we've come to know and love, but like as its original mining town origins back in the 1800s. We've still got Michael Gross starring. This franchise has basically become his at this point, but he's playing one of Burt's ancestors. And the new setting of this makes everything a bit more refreshing, and the fact that unlike films 2 and 3, the characters in this film don't know what the graboids are already, and so the story goes back to more of that sort of those mysterious beginnings you get at the beginning of the original film when no one really knows what's happening. And so overall it just feels a bit more like the first one. It's not just straight up let's get on with the monsters and the mayhem. It takes its time and, you know, builds up the suspense and mystery a bit more, and that makes it probably the best one since the original. I don't think any of these direct-to-video sequels can quite live up to the sort of rare magic that happened on the first one, but Tremors 4 gets the closest. I don't have any particular information about what happened next exactly, but it's now going to be 11 years before we get the next Tremors film. And then they come back in 2015 with Tremors 5 Bloodlines. But at this point also basically everybody behind the scenes making this film is completely new. It was apparently at least vaguely based on the script by the original creators Maddock and Wilson, but because they weren't going to have any creative control over it, they decided they didn't want their names on it at all. And so at this point the only remaining connection to the first 4 films is Michael Gross's character Burt Gummer. He gets another completely different plucky young sidekick with this one, and the action in this one takes place in Africa, and that gives them the excuse to kind of redesign the graboids. They're bigger and a bit more aggressive, and they explain about having evolved differently on different continents. But also, of course, by 2015 technology has got up to the point where they can do the graboids entirely in CG and have them actually look pretty good. I quite like the updated design on the Graboid. The Shriekers a bit less so, they seem a bit sort of generic, but you know, they'll do. There are definitely a few questionable moments in this film, and it's by far from perfect, but it still manages to, you know, maintain that pretty fun monster movie vibe and ends up being quite satisfying enough. This new production company doesn't wait too long. It's only 3 years later, 2018, we get Tremors: A Cold Day in Hell. They seem to have given up adding the numbers in the title at this point, but that's number 6 in case we're counting. Of course, Michael Gross is back as Bert, but we've also got returning Jamie Kennedy as his sidekick. The first time we've had a returning main character since Fred Ward in 1 and 2. Now this one, I feel, is a little bit of an oddity. There are some really nice ideas in this one, but there are also some really awfully terrible ones. So it ends up as a bit of a weird mix. The visuals of the Graboid, this time in the snow in the Arctic tundra of Canada, look amazing. There's super fun action sequences and ingenious traps and some very, very nice Graboid kills. But along with that, some of the dialogue is some of the most clunky I have ever heard in my life. People just do not talk like that, as far as I know. And the characterization of Bert himself just didn't feel right. You know, he's always been a bit of a right-wing gun nut, prepping in the desert kind of guy, but here he seems to have suddenly got more of a sort of conspiracy theorist nutjob vibe, which didn't quite feel right. So yeah, unless you're big into the entire franchise here, you can probably skip that one and not miss much. And then finally, for now, just a couple of years later, we have Tremors Shrieker Island. Bert is back and he's got himself a brand new sidekick yet again. With that Hawaiian shirt and weird look on his face, I kind of, probably unfairly, expected him to be sort of, you know, the lazy slacker type, but he was actually surprisingly competent at his job and the dealing with the Shriekers. Bert's character felt a bit more like back to normal in this one. The location filming was in a lot more visually interesting place than most of the last one. The effects were good, the story was fine, and I had a surprisingly good time with this one. Probably helped by the fact that after A Cold Day in Hell, my expectations were a little bit lower. Because, as I forgot to mention, all of the 3 most recent ones were written and directed by the same guy. But for some reason, the middle one just didn't live up as the same as the other 2. This new director, Don Michael Paul, is not someone I've ever heard of before. His filmography seems to be lots of weird sort of sequels that no one's really heard of, like Jarhead 2 or Kindergarten Cop 2. And it seems like Tremors 5, 6 and 7 are actually probably his most famous films. So I guess it's maybe something along the lines of, you know, 5 was based on a script by other people, 6 he tried to do it himself and didn't go very well, and you know, 7 he's learned a bit and started improving. And so that brings us to the end. There is currently no known plans for an 8th film in the franchise, although Michael Gross is on record of saying he is willing to do at least another one, but if they're going to, they need to get on with it because, you know, he's going to be in his mid-70s soon. That's getting on a little bit to be running around and shooting giant worms. But still, overall, Tremors series is a series I am a big fan of, despite sort of some low points of, say, 2 and 6. And, you know, particularly if you've seen and enjoyed the original but have always been wary of the direct-to-video sequels, I would say they're worth a try. What are your thoughts on the Tremors franchise? Have you seen any of them? Do you care? Tell me about those thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.